you think there's an awareness amongst the administration that we have united much of the world against us?
Uh, I don't know about within the administration. Trump doesn't seem to understand that. He just seems to think that, well, again, I'm the world hegemon and they should be listening to me. They should be obeying me. And when they don't, it's because they're being terribly unreasonable. But there is definitely an awareness within parts of the establishment. No less a person than John Bolton actually was very critical of Trump's punitive tariffs on India. He said this was just insane. And he was, for once he was right. It just didn't make any sense from a U.S. strategic point of view. It very, very negligible, if any, economic gains for us and just a huge diplomatic, a geopolitical loss.
Yeah, I just seems I don't see how you cannot be aware. How the Trump administration can't. They have to be aware, right? You can just sense it. You can just feel it.
Yeah.
You can see it. Everybody, they're all coming together, and it's just common sense. You've been attacking the whole world. Gaza in itself would probably unite a lot of people against us. And then you have this on top of the tariffs, on top of what we're doing in Ukraine, and then the few friends that we do have, we're twisting their arms. They're not really our friends. I don't think they like this relationship, but they're still part of it, but unwilling partners. There has to be just common sense. I mean, he's a businessman. He has to read the room.
Right. You would think so. We don't want to put this all on Trump because, this all preceded Trump. Trump is just accelerating the process. But,
Tariffs,
again, many
though,
people.
I mean,
Yeah, the tariffs, that's a new thing. That's right. And that has, and especially the tariffs on allies. I think that's something that the previous administration would never have done, and that's really quite extraordinary. But, this position of bringing our enemy, because of our general hostility, our hostility to so much of the world, we've driven our enemies together and united them against us. That preceded Trump. Again, that was Biden was very hostile to China, not just to Russia, and of course to Iran. So he helped, and previous administrations helped to solidify, these relationships and to essentially create a bloc, even if they're not calling it a bloc. It's just because of our, again, kind of general undifferentiated hostility. Quite naturally, all the countries that are on the receiving end of it are going to band together to resist our hostility and our penalties and so forth. It's just that Trump has taken this to up to the next level and beyond with his tariffs. I think under Biden there was tension already between the U.S. and India, but there was criticism of India's policies, and accusations that they were behind an assassination, this kind of thing, very public accusations. But I think there were these criticisms, so this resulted in a certain amount of tension between the U.S. and India, but the relationship basically held up. But it has really suffered under Trump. It's not just his tariffs, but some of his previous statements, like his claim that somehow he single-handedly brought about a truce between India and Pakistan. The Indians apparently are very upset about that. As they say, just completely untrue. That it was actually the Pakistanis that came to India, and that's what the Indians say. So there's a great deal of anger with India. Actually, like Modi himself is being very careful, very measured in what he's saying about the U.S. He hasn't launched any kind of he's used very temperate language vis-a-vis the U.S. But it's clear, first of all, that they're remaining firm. They're actually increasing their purchases of Russian oil, and they said quite, very politely but very firmly, we are an independent country and we're not going to, bow down and, allow you to dictate to us, what our policies are. And then at the same time, he's, again, opening the door to China. So you can see there's been a real change.
Right. Yeah. India always felt like it was a country that was kind of in the U.S. camp. There's strong relations, big, lots of ties between us and India. Um, but now, do you feel that these ties are largely severed or severing, or has there been a poll recently in India to show Indians' views of the United States? I mean, I imagine the favorability has to have been plummeting.
Yeah, right. Well, I've heard that, again, Modi has been very, very temperate in his language. But if you go onto Indian social media, this is what I hear. The language is not at all temperate. People are really very, very angry in India. They're very angry about this. It's kind of similar to like what you find in Russia, where like the general population actually just wants the Russian military to take their gloves off, and but Putin's always very, very careful, very cautious, and again is very, very reluctant to actually openly condemn the Americans or anything. Modi's kind of the same way, but yeah, if there's any pressure with India, it's actually to actually distance ourselves even further from the U.S. At least that's from the general population, as I understand it. Now, there's a large business community that has been very strongly pro-U.S. There are a lot of connections. As you know, there are many Indians living in the U.S., many very highly educated Indians. I think they're in the U.S. They're the single wealthiest, ethnic group. So many doctors and engineers, IT guys are Indians in this country. So there are real ties, between the U.S. and India. But again, it's kind of similar to what happened in Russia, where there were many, many ties between Russians, and especially educated Russians in the West. And the educated Russians tended to be, very favorable towards the West. But because of the West's own policies, that they themselves have been turning away. And like your sister was just telling me the other day, she knows somebody that was in that camp. The one guy that ran off, when the mobilization was first announced by Putin back in 2022, and then came back. But his mother she's talked to her, and she was always very, very pro-Western, and always said, like I'll never go to Sochi. I'm sure that's just a trashy place, and always vacationed in Western Europe and Italy, and but now she's changed her mind. I mean, a lot of it is because of the sanctions. They're forced, well, I guess we'll try Sochi. Hey, Sochi's actually great, It's actually better than the place in Italy that we used to go to. What were we thinking? This is a process that's happening in Russia, and maybe we're seeing the beginnings of it in India too.
Yeah, no, it just makes perfect sense. Why we turn the whole world against us. But it's interesting also thinking about, we talk about the multipolar world, and in my mind, the multipolar world was just like everybody's kind of equal, and there's their own group in each area. But with the developments between India and China and Russia, we kind of almost have more like a superpole right there. If those three countries together, I mean that's really BRICS. I mean, just population-wise, we're talking about 40% of the world just between India, China, and Russia, and mostly, of course, India and China make up basically 95% of that, almost 90%.
Right.
But
right.
but you have Russia that basically has unlimited resources, so you can just have this sort of perfect synergy of the manufacturing power and the working labor capital of these countries that. In my mind, it's like, okay, well, that's the future. This is where it's going to be. Brazil will do things, maybe South Africa will do things, whatever. But really, this is where it's at, and it's almost like you were having a new pole, and it's right here. These three countries.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. Now, like all the BRICS leaders say, we are not interested in bloc politics, and I think to a great extent they're sincere about that. But, the problem is that bloc politics may be interested in you. I think that's what they're discovering, like India is discovering. The Indians were particularly, firm about that. We're not going to do, we're not interested in developing an alternative to the dollar and all this and that. And, but again, it's like each one of these countries, after they get a direct taste of, of U.S. hostility, they get clubbed by the U.S. It wakes them up and say, hey, we've actually got to reorient ourselves. We can't just we have to prepare for an all-out attack by the U.S., not necessarily military, and so that means we need to tighten and improve our ties with all these people and develop, alliances or quasi-alliances, strategic partnerships with these other nations. It just becomes a matter of necessity. And I think that's what we see happening. It's just, because we, it just seems like we're incapable of just letting countries go their own way and respecting their sovereignty. We are creating a bloc in Eurasia.
Right. Yeah, it's a 3-country superpower bloc. But I feel almost like it's safer in a way if you have 3 countries that all provide something unique, I believe, in the relationship. I don't think you can just say one is definitively better than all the others in any category. So I feel like that gives a sense of balance, where in the United States, you just have the U.S. and it gets to run around and dictate everything. Here, I don't have the fear of any type of hegemonic thinking being born out of a sort of a 3-block, which they're all what's also interesting is they're all very distinctly different culturally and ethnically.
Right.
So it just creates this natural balance that I'm more comfortable with having this lead the world. Like, okay, they shouldn't go so insane and have just one type of ideological thinking won't be able to grip all 3 of them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that seems to be true. I mean, that none of these countries is in the grip of some sort of ideological zealotry. They were in the past. I mean, certainly China and Russia were, under the Maoists in China, and then under, the Soviets in Russia. But I think actually that experience kind of disabused them of certain notions, and they decided, yeah, we're not doing that again. That didn't work out. That didn't work out well for the world or for us. And they have, I think quite consistently just taken a much humbler approach. We're not interested in interfering in the sovereignty of other countries. They can, each country can develop along its own path, and just let us develop on our path. I really, they seem to be very sincere about that. I mean, they back that up with actions, and I think you find out again and again. It's like the rhetoric in this country is that these are authoritarian countries that are want to that are aiming to subordinate these other countries and force them to conform to their own objectives, their own dictates. But the reality is really quite the reverse. Just like you see what happens in a place like Belarus. That's a good example. That we forget, because now Belarus is so tight with Russia. Lukashenko is really thrown in his lot completely with the Russians, but we forget why. It wasn't too long ago that he was playing the 2 sides off against each other. He was kind of playing footsie under the table with the Westerners, and he was making all kinds of concessions to the EU, and but then so he thought that he had gotten on the good side of them, and the Russians did anything and say, okay, again, we just hope you'll stay neutral. We're, but you have your own country. But the EU doesn't have that thought, and they attempted a coup. And when he became aware of that, they attempted a color revolution. That was the end of it. It was just like, okay, I can't trust these people. They won't accept my sovereignty. The Russians will. So we're going into the Russian camp, and I think other countries are finding that out, like Georgia too.
Okay, so if most of the world is banding together against us, and we have very, very powerful countries that we never thought would be together, now together, basically to be an antidote to the United States, and then our few friends that we do have secretly hate us and curse us behind our back, then how long can this go on? What does this mean for us? This significant? Does it just mean that we'll get the rug pulled out from under us? The dollar's going to collapse? Like what happens?
Yeah, well, it can go on for a while. For I think potentially, it could go on for quite a while. Even if there's a great deal of grumbling, there's we're still a very powerful country. We have all kinds of levers, military and economic. Our soft power has been degraded, but it's still actually quite powerful within, the Western sphere. I think outside, where there's much more awareness of what we've done, especially like in places like Gaza, the soft power is diminished significantly. It is just diminishing within the Western sphere, but we still have very firm control, let's say, of the information space. And that means that a surprisingly large number, I know that it's decreasing over time and there are more and more dissidents, but it's still a surprisingly large number of people really do believe in the authorities in the West. So it could last for a while, but maybe comes down to the dollar. It's just like for a lot of people, maybe, like the West has lost its gleam, but there's still a lot of dollars there, and dollars are worth having. And, so we'll maybe want to immigrate there, or we want to do business with them. But if the dollar really does collapse, if it loses its reserve status, then it's like, people will finally say, well, what's the point? It's just like, why are we oriented towards the West? You still see people that are like fanatically oriented to the West, doing whatever they can to bring their countries into it. Like was it Maya Sandu in Moldova, or Pashinyan in Armenia. But these people seem to me particularly foolish. Like they're jumping onto a sinking ship. 20 years ago, I could have understood it, but now it just seems I wouldn't have approved it. I don't think it would have been right, and even very intelligent at that time. But you could still understand why people had this faith in the West. But it's still there. It's amazing. Even though if they really open their eyes, they can understand that this is a mistake to really tie ourselves to this enterprise. I think it's going to, like the Pashinyans and the Sandus, they're going to lose, they're going to cease to exist when the dollar, ceases to exist, or at least as a reserve currency. That's my guess.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'm always kind of surprised how long the dollar is able to keep going. I just feel like with the writings on the wall, then wouldn't that lend to some type of almost the panic run? Instead of people walking away from the dollar, shouldn't they be sprinting away from the dollar now? But it seems like it's like there's a fire in the movie theater and everybody is slow walking to the exit. But at some point, aren't when people start going to start running, and then it's just, or is there a chance that these countries, like the amount of debt that I know China's been divesting a lot of its U.S. treasuries, been unloading its debt, but it still has a lot. I mean, couldn't these BRICS countries have this debt is kind of their Damocles sword for the United States, right? Couldn't they just say, like, if the U.S. really tries to go after them, via tariffs, militarily, whatever, can they just say, well, okay, we're dumping all of our dollars, and then who wants to buy these dollars? Nobody wants them anymore. Most of the world's rejecting it, and then the United States is in trouble. The U.S. has to buy them themselves. We start having hyperinflation. Like, is that the plan? I'm trying to think it. I don't know. I'm not a
Well, I could see. I don't know that it is the plan of the Chinese, but sure, it does give them a weapon that they could use in the case of open conflict. I mean, there are actually so many different weapons they can use because the U.S. is in so many ways dependent on China. Again, even our military-industrial complex is dependent on Chinese manufacturing to a great extent. Rare earths is just one example of that. And then, as we found out during COVID, there are all kinds of supply chains that have their beginning in China. And then another weapon they have, of course, is those U.S. Treasury bonds. They could just dump them all in one fell swoop. But I don't know what their strategy is. That's, it's possible that may be part of their, what they're holding them in reserve for that. Or they may be just walking away from it, because if you dump them all at once, you don't get a very good price on them. Like maybe that's why they're walking. You see, like before the panic, they try to sell as much as they can at sell off at so they get a decent return. Wherever, right?
Don't the Brits hold more than the Chinese now? Something like that?
I don't know. Yeah, that would be quite extraordinary, but it may be true.
Yeah, I mean, I feel bad for all of our so-called friends. We're just unloading all of our debt onto them. Like, you take this, buy all of our weapons, give us all your money, and they're just like, yes, thank you. You know, like, don't you realize what's happening here, guys? You know?
Yeah.
And part of me, I don't want to try to save the dollar because I think it's beyond saving. So it's just, for me, it's like, maybe it's better. We just need to get it. If we get it over with now, and maybe it can help end the genocide in Gaza and end these wars, just end the U.S. empire. Because I feel like as soon as that's what needs to happen, as soon as the money dries up or the money becomes worthless, you can't fund these projects anymore. These evil campaigns across the world. So yeah, I don't know. I need to come quick, but I feel like the BRICS should do it for the sake of the world. You know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I would hope that that's the outcome, that there's actually just sort of a peaceful collapse, and then it followed by a period of rebuilding and reorientation, reassessment. That would be the ideal. But but a collapse like that, you never know what the outcome is. You say, we could have all kinds of dangerous demagogues arise. It doesn't. At this point, I'm not sure that we would respond to it rationally. Our tendency always seems to be to point the finger at someone else. It's the Venezuelans or whatever. They're behind this, the Iranians, right? And so it could lead to further military campaigns. They may not be able to support these, but they could still do a lot of damage. So I don't think it's possible that the BRICS are going to do that. I think they're going to be, all of those leaders are really, they have made firm decisions. It appears, which way they're headed, but they're prudent, rational, cautious people, and I think they're just going to let the U.S. fall on its own.
Yeah, okay, it makes sense. I mean, that's why I shouldn't be in charge. I'm always wanting to smash that button. Like, just what are we doing? Just get this over with.
Right.
But are you in agreement that there is no saving the dollar, though? Right? I think this is true. You just look at the huge trends that we're seeing between the creation of the BRICS and the fact that our economic sanctions don't work. It's just. And we have 37 trillion in debt, and we know that there's no digging out of this hole. It's just an inevitability at this point. And it's just weird to me that if you are aware of that, if you agree that the dollar is dead, what's everybody doing with these dollars? We're just like, we know the ending of the story, but nobody's acting like they know the end of the story. We just kind of pretend and just hope, because I guess the system is just so entrenched and ingrained that it has to move forward, but we know it doesn't work, but we got to keep doing it.
Yeah. Well, there is a lot of institutional inertia. The fact is that, of course, there are governments that are moving away from the dollar. But like you said, they're walking away from it. And so, for the first time, I think maybe ever, certainly in my memory, we do see that. People, there is a steady trend, it's gradual, but away from the dollar. But why isn't it happening faster? Again, there's just this institutional inertia. I think there's just this sort of, what do you call it? Sort of a status quo bias. It's like, this is the way things are. And then you just kind of think that this is the way things have to be. It's been like this for decades and decades and decades, essentially since the end of World War II. And, we're talking about 80 years. So we've had generations, 3 generations since then. And it's just like, that was the one thing you could rely on is the U.S. dollar. And it's hard for, I think, a lot of institutions and individuals to stop thinking that way. I think that's part of it. And then there's just and maybe a lot of people understand that, it's a matter of time, but they think they can get out, when that time comes or before the time. And that's true of a lot of investors. It's just, again, I think it is true. It's inevitable that this current system has to collapse. It's unsustainable. In the end, you look at it, the current trends, there's just no way that it can't collapse. But the question is when, and that's always a very difficult question to answer, and nobody really knows for sure. So I think probably a lot of people, there may be people in the establishment and central banks, they've convinced, yeah, this is going to happen. But at the present, it is convenient for us to hold these dollars. It's just like they're going to look for certain signs that it's imminent, and then hope, looking from their perspective, they hope that they can pull out of it, before the others do. But of course, that's a kind of a dangerous game. Everybody's thinking the same thing, and then it happens at once, and that's why, these walking turns to running, and we have this sudden collapse.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, like we said, it'll be the poor that get screwed. The asset class, the wealthy will still make off as bandits with this whole thing. They already are, but I mean, it's just going to get, I think, accelerate. Do you think just historically, is America now the most hated it's ever been in its history?
Well, it probably is, again, in large part thanks to Gaza, but not just that, and we've seen again the tariffs that have been slapped on so-called friends. I think it's really is creating a lot of anger around the world among all kinds of people that were favorably disposed to us before. I understand that the Japanese and the South Koreans, like for the first time ever, are really starting to think, hey, maybe we need to diversify. Again, it's just like before, the strategy is you just stay in the U.S. camp. You're a loyal follower of the U.S. That, and without exception. Well, now I think they're looking for more and more exceptions, and that's going to be the general trend.
Do you think that there's any way that we can become loved again, or that this is it? It's done. It's over. I mean, this in itself, that global sentiment towards a global hegemon is also its life bar. If the world doesn't want you as a global hegemon, it's just a matter of time that, we all know where this is going. So,
right.
Is there any way you can reverse that and all of a sudden people love us again? I doubt it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only solution is to actually to accept the trend and become part of the multipolar world and give up on the idea of global hegemony. And I think that's the only way. That's all of these are symptoms of, actually a global hegemon that's losing its grip on power and is lashing out in different ways. And that's just going to it's going to cause the global hegemon to sink, to lose, just by flailing out in the way that it is now, to actually accelerate the process of its own demise. Yeah, I think the only solution, is to actually truly adopt a humble foreign policy and become just one, yet one other pole, and a very important pole, within the multipolar world.